Athenian Demokratia was founded in 508 to 507 and lasted until 322 BCE, with a couple of resurgences thereafter. Democratic Athens was one of the greatest powers in the ancient Greek world for some 2 centuries, in addition to being a bastion of high culture, from some of the earliest histories to poetry and pottery to monumental architecture to philosophy, comedy, and tragedy. However, the most cited achievement of Athens was being the world's first democracy. In this lecture, we will critically examine the Athenian Demokratia to see how it compares to modern liberal democracy. We will examine some of the key institutions in addition to considering the socioeconomic basis of Demokratia. For the sake of brevity, Tritiis, Demes, the Areopagus, and the Nomothetai have all been excluded just to avoid excessive detail. Additionally, we will not be discussing the ontology of citizens and individuals in the ancient world, as that would be a little bit too complex for what is intended ultimately as a primer for first-time students of Athenian Demokratia. So let's ask a very basic question to get things started. What is Demokratia? Demokratia literally means the power of the people. The demos, that is the citizen body as a whole, meets together and by majority vote makes decisions that affect the entire polis. The only people who participate in what we would think of as the political sphere are adult males. However, women and children are also part of the demos so long as they are citizens by birth. One of the most important characteristics both of Athenian Demokratia and really of any Greek polis is that it has layers of inclusion and exclusion. You are included as a part of the demos if you are born as a citizen. If you are not born as a citizen, you are not a part of the demos, even if you live in Athens for your entire life. So a lot of it is based on there being boundaries between people groups. There is a rule of law in any Demokratia, but despite the fact that there are rules which govern how people interact with one another and people's obligations and the ability to participate for certain individuals, there are no individual rights in the way that we think of them. In the modern world, there are certain rights that we have, usually what we call negative liberties, where a government cannot ask certain things of us. However, in a Demokratia, the demos as a whole holds all the power. So if the demos meets together and they decide that one of their citizens needs to be treated in a certain way, then there are no laws which can prevent the power of the demos from taking hold. In many ways, you could think of Demokratia as something like the dictatorship of the people. In general, however, what the people decide is in the public interest and is not a massive violation of individual freedoms. However, we have to keep in mind that there are no individual protections. So, that is something that would only emerge centuries and centuries later. The most democratic feature of any Greek polis, and something that was at the heart of Demokratia, one of the many things at the heart of Demokratia, is selecting citizens by lot to hold important offices. This was considered fair and impartial. If you draw a name out of a hat, or you select with a stone with somebody's name on it, or however the lot was conducted, then what you were doing was finding the will of the gods. Because the gods control random chance. And the gods are fair and balanced. They will not engage in any kind of partisanship, and the only requirement to be eligible for the lot is to be, again, a citizen. For specialized positions, such as commanders, you really need to have elections. Now, many Greek theorists felt that elections were more oligarchic than democratic. However, for certain positions, you have to have a certain skill set and a certain amount of public trust. And so, for that reason, you do have to have elections in the Demokratia. One final point that builds on what I was saying earlier, both about there being no individual rights as such, and about the extent of the power of the demos, ancient constitutions go far beyond what we think of as the purely political. So, for instance, if you were to read Polybius's Book 6 on the Roman Constitution, things such as the way that the Romans conduct funerals and the way that they draft men into their manipular legions, those things are all part of the Roman Constitution. In Sparta, the way that they train their children, the agoge, that is part of the Constitution. Today, when we define constitutions, we define them not only by looking at individual rights as part of it, but also we keep things strictly political. We wouldn't, for instance, talk about how Netflix and chill is a part of our Constitution. It is just something that has emerged and will probably go away at some point. So, ancient constitutions included both what we think of as laws and also customs. And because these things are not written down and they're not fixed in stone, the way that, say, the modern U.S. Constitution is, there is a lot more room for change and growth than one would think possible with a modern constitution. So, now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's move into some of the particulars and look at how the Demokratia works in practice. Most modern accounts date the birth of democracy to the Kleistenic reforms in 508 to 507 BCE. If you were to read Aristotle's Constitution of the Athenians, however, he would say that the Kleistenic reforms were tribal reforms. He would not call this the birth of Demokratia. So what are the tribal reforms and why were these so vital to the creation of Demokratia as we think of it? Well, the Pisistrid tyrants had ruled Athens since about 550 and they had only recently been expelled when Cleisthenes began to legislate. The Pisistrids had made a number of advancements in Attica, including conquering some of the outlying areas of the peninsula and also instituting a number of religious festivals. There are scholars who even believe that they were the ones who spread the Athenian identity from shore to shore. However, I stand with Greg Anderson and other scholars who believe that it was only the Kleisthenic reforms which created the cultural and political unity of Attica. By 508 to 7 at the latest, all the inhabitants of Attica, all the people on the Attic Peninsula, were Athenian citizens. And again, this goes back to the idea of a polis being more than merely a single city. A polis is a political community. And Athens, therefore, includes this entire peninsula, even though most of it is unsettled farmland in antiquity. There are also other towns in Attica, by the way, and it looks like at one point in their history they were independent of Athens, but by the time we get to the classical period, after Cleisthenes, all of these towns identify as a part of Athens. The Kleisthenic reforms really either created or deepened a shared sense of identity that was vital for Demokratia. People have to identify as being part of the same whole, as having a common goal and belonging to a common community in order for them to cooperate sufficiently to function in this way. Now, how did he do it? Well, in order to draw people together, what he did was he created 10 tribes that were completely artificial and made up. Each one of them was named after a local hero. And people from different areas would be divided into what are known as trides, and 3 trides would equal 1 tribe. So what he'd do is he combine usually people who live around the city of Athens or the port of Piraeus with people who live in some other rural part. And by combining people together in this way, what he did effectively was to create a unified whole. If you feel a sense of kinship and camaraderie with people you've never met on the other side of your community, then what this does is it creates a shared feeling of being Athenian. And while this seems kind of awkward and forced to us, this worked extremely well for the Athenians, and they began to take their new tribal identity very seriously. These trides that you see on the map that are marked were also subdivided into demes. We're not going to go into demes. Those are basically just local districts, and each one of them had their own little government, and they were useful for the purposes of record keeping and local administration. But At any rate, you can see how this system changed the way that the Athenian society was organized, and it's only when you have this level of integration and organization that you can have something like a Demokratia in operation. Politically speaking, the two most important institutions of democratic Athens were the Ekklesia and the Boule. As has often been stated, Athenian Demokratia is an example of direct democracy. The Boule is a council of 500 men. They're all chosen by lot, 50 from each tribe, so that way geographically all of Athens is represented. And they were responsible primarily for setting the agenda of the Ekklesia. They did not make binding decisions, but what they could do is help frame debates going into the main meeting of the citizens. The Boule met in a place called the Bouleuterion, which is in the Agora, the major center of business and commerce in Athens, and so it would be accessible to anyone who wanted to visit. One member of the Boule would be chosen by lot to be president for the day, and his job was to wait day and night in the Bouleuterion and receive any kind of news or updates that he might need to convey to the rest of the Boule and ultimately to the Ekklesia. So for instance, if you were the president of the day, you might be the first person to meet with the visiting envoy. And so then you would set him up to meet with the Boule as a whole or to address the Ekklesia in order to pass a treaty or what have you. You would also be there to preside if some new development were to occur, such as somebody came to you and started trying to initiate a trial. So for instance, Socrates, the philosopher, was president of the day when the Athenians started to move toward doing a mass trial of the generals from the Battle of Arginusi. And he tried to slow down the process, but couldn't quite slow it down. So that is an example of the president's role. The president of the Boule was effectively kind of a figurehead. He was just a stand-in. And despite the seeming importance of such a role, the fact is that Athenian experience shows anyone could hold that role, because this person's job was effectively just to serve as a representative of the Athenian people just for one day. Now, as for the Ekklesia itself, it had a quorum of 6,000. So of the estimated 30,000 or so Athenian citizens, they only needed 6,000 to meet in order to hold a meeting. They would then debate on issues and vote to pass decrees. The Athenian Ekklesia met about 40 times per year, and they met on a designated area, the Pnyx Hill, which was right off of the Agora and with a great view of the Acropolis. This was deliberately left bare to help the acoustics, which is also how the Athenians built theaters, by the way. They would build them in the hillsides in order to create natural acoustics. And the only thing that they built on the Pnyx Hill was a platform for speakers who would then address the Ekklesia as a whole. 10 or so of those 40 meetings, by the way, were ones that were considered major meetings, and at those meetings you could actually call out and try to get sitting officials voted out of office. And it's worth noting that officials only served for terms of 1 year at a time. But the Athenians were, I guess you could say, obsessed enough with accountability that they gave their people 10 chances per year to vote people out if they thought that their performance was unsatisfactory. As I mentioned earlier, most Athenian officials were selected by lot. The lot was considered to be the most democratic and fair way to select officials. Another addition that made this even more democratic is that not only would officials be selected by lot, but they would serve together on boards and share their power with other men who were selected the same way. So typically, a given task or responsibility would be divided amongst the members of a board, and then together, this board, all selected at random, would make decisions on their area of competence. Officials selected by lot had a large range of responsibilities. There were officials who would supervise commerce in the Agora, or check out and keep track of naval equipment, including ropes and sails at the Piraeus. There were men who would hold the routine audits for officials, such as the generals or the trierarchs, the men who would fund and command Athenian warships for a year. And actually, the list of officials and their task is a pretty long one. A pretty large number of Athenians any given year were engaged in what we would think of as government work. And because the lot would operate to involve as many people as possible, this meant that a good number of Athenian citizens at some point in their lives would hold office and participate directly in the act of governance. You might be thinking, well, how did they get the job done if we know in antiquity many people were illiterate and a lot of these tasks are a bit beyond the competence of, say, just a random farmer from rural Attica? Well, because there's a need for both specialized knowledge and basic literacy, there were officials in place to help the office holders. I call them officials because I'm not sure how else to describe them, but I'm talking, of course, about the demasioi. These are publicly owned slaves who are basically administrative experts. They're the closest thing that Athens has to professional bureaucrats. They have no actual power. However, their advice was usually heeded by magistrates because the demasioi were specially trained for these tasks. And while we're on the topic of literacy, it would appear that because of Athenian activity and the Demokratia, all these men getting involved in government, that actually the literacy rate in Athens was 2 to 3 times higher than the norm for antiquity. We estimate that in general, classical antiquity saw about a 10% literacy rate. Athens might have had about a 30% literacy rate. And that's a pretty significant difference. For the most part, an average Athenian with a dedicated demasios was capable of handling most tasks. But sometimes there were tasks that were a little too tall for an average farmer. And so, because of that, when it came to tasks which required a great deal of skill, specialized knowledge, international standing, and commanding the trust of his fellow citizens, the Athenians turned to election to find the men who would hold those spots. And so, the chief example of an elected position in Athens is that the Athenians had a board of 10 generals who would represent them militarily. Originally, each tribe elected one general, but later on this was opened up to the entire citizen body, and so you could elect any 10 Athenians. There were property requirements for the generals, something that we will revisit a little later on. But suffice it to say for now that there was a great deal of freedom in who got to be elected general. The generals worked together on a board, so no one of them was a commander-in-chief, despite some scholars who mistakenly believed that. The Athenian generals oversaw Athenian military operations. This included everything from making sure that the triremes in the docks were battle-ready, to collecting tribute, to making sure that the demes were keeping track of men who were eligible for hoplite service, to training men who were under arms, to conducting existing operations. A lot of things were handled by the generals and their assistants. They did a lot of administrative work at home, even when Athens was at peace. In times of war, typically the generals would propose operations to the demos at the Ekklesia, and they would then be authorized to carry them out. While in later times the Athenians would develop specialized roles for different generals, early on, each general was seen as interchangeable with all the others. And so, the Ekklesia would send out generals typically who proposed campaigns, rather than having, say, a designated general who would go out and fight. And also, an interesting feature of Athenian generalship is that often they would command together, as a group, 2 or 3 at a time. And this is something that the Romans did away with after the Battle of Cannae, and that other societies did away with at various points, including the Spartans. But the Athenians were able to do this kind of shared command, and never had any disasters because of it directly. So for the most part, these shared commands did not really impede the ability of the Athenians to get the job done. Which is interesting, because every other society that's tried this has run into that obstacle. And not only would the generals need to get the permission of the Ekklesia before setting out, but often they would have to send back to Athens to get permission to do additional moves, or to, say, execute or enslave captured people who had fallen into their hands. So the Ekklesia had a lot of oversight of what the generals would do. Additionally, the Ekklesia would choose the men who would be a part of embassies. There was no State Department. There were no designated people who were experts on a particular region or polis. The only people who would be called experts are the guys who would go before the Ekklesia and lecture them about Sparta or Corinth. Some of them also had guest friendships with those areas, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they were guaranteed to be the chief ambassador. So what would happen is they would have a debate about what to do about a neighboring polis, and then the Ekklesia would choose a number of men, typically from men they knew well. So the guys who had just been talking to them, who had proposals about what to do, and sometimes some of the generals would also get selected and sent out. So they would always choose men that they knew and trusted. So the point that I'm trying to make is that even though these officials are elected, they are still always serving on boards. There was never an embassy less than 3 people, and they were always accountable to the Ekklesia on pretty much a daily basis. No one was given a lot of rope to go out and just do whatever they wanted. So, unless it was an expedition that was very far away from home base. And even then, usually had multiple commanders on the scene. And keep in mind, the men under them were part of the demos. They were their fellow citizens. So you can see how elected officials were still being held in check, even on a daily basis, from overexerting their authority and undermining the principles of Demokratia. Under the Demokratia, the Athenian legal system was, as you might imagine, rather more democratic than we would think of a court system being. Because of the emphasis on the power of the demos, the Athenian law system had few hard and fast limitations on what someone could be charged with or what the penalty for that crime was. Depending on the legal procedure that the prosecutor invoked, and there were several to choose from based on the severity of what they're trying to charge them with, there would be between 201 and 501 dicast assigned. Dicast are sort of a combined judge and jury. So unlike in a modern case where you have a judge who gives instructions to a jury, in an Athenian case, you could think of the dicast as either all being judges or all being jurors. But in effect, there is no one giving instructions on what the audience who vote, the dicast, should think. The only people who really get to speak at an Athenian trial are the prosecutor and the defendant. Men would represent themselves. It was extremely unusual to have what we'd think of as lawyers in ancient Greece. The Romans did have lawyers, but the Greeks not as much, especially not the Athenians. There were men who did make a living writing speeches for people who went on trial, however. They were called logographers. But then they would have to have, the person they wrote it for would either have to memorize it or read it out loud in court. Speakers had a time limit, but there were no rules about what they could say. So for instance, in Plato's Apology, where Socrates is on trial for impiety, we have what is supposedly his defense speech. And he doesn't really go through anything that we would consider to be legal statutes. He doesn't talk about, say, freedom of religion or speech laws. He basically just defends the merits of his thoughts. And basically says that he is helping the Athenians as a whole to be more open-minded with his actions and words. He ultimately lost, and then the second part of the trial, which is a feature of most Athenian trials, is that then the prosecutor and defense will propose a penalty, and then the dicast will vote on the penalty. So, if you come up with a penalty that's reasonable enough to satisfy the anger of the dicast, then you can get off with things and not be put to death or put in exile or anything like that. But if, say, you do what Socrates says, and he says, because I'm guilty, I should be kept in the area where the athletes who won at the Olympics are fed for free every day. That didn't fly, and so he was condemned to death. So you can see how the courts are rather fast and loose in terms of how they operate, but at the same time, the people have full control. And for the most part, things like the trial of Socrates are exceptions, not the rule. We have no other cases where someone was effectively condemned and put to death for thought crimes. And actually, everyone after the trial of Socrates was horrified at what had happened, and the Athenians made conscious efforts not to let it happen again. One thing that I alluded to briefly is that the men who were elected to positions of leadership, that is to say, the generals and ambassadors, needed to be men of standing and reputation. Well, these are men of the elite, men who were born wealthy, often into aristocratic families that tried to trace their descent back to a god or hero. And one of the distinctive features of the Demokratia is that while it does empower the demos as a whole, a lot of the actual work, a surprising amount in fact, is done by the elite. And they also really go out of their way to spend money from their own private reserves in order to fund many of the institutions of the Demokratia. So just to give you some examples of elite contributions to this system, all of the prosecutors who act in the interest of the demos were volunteers, and most of them are well-educated elites who go after their peers for abuses. Sometimes they are prosecuting because they are rivals with someone, but other times they're going after someone because that person was guilty of malfeasance. The orators in the Ekklesia were almost all members of the elite. If you think about it, only men who have a certain amount of education and confidence will go before a body of several thousand people and try to speak. We also know that if someone who was a poor speaker and clearly was not well educated would go up and try to speak, that the Athenians were wont to boo at him and order him off the stage. So almost all of the men involved in the debates of Athens were wealthy men. The generals also were men who not only were wealthy, but had to volunteer for service. Keeping up with the records of, say, the hoplites and monitoring the docks to make sure that repairs are being done to the triremes and leading men into battle, sometimes even raising money on your own accord from foreign bankers while you're away from home. All of the tasks that a general would have to do are exhausting. And so being a general is not just some cool way to gain prestige and political power, it's also a lot of work. And for that reason, many members of the elite were not willing to run for the office. But the men who were willing to do it had to put in a whole lot of sweat, blood, tears, and also spend a lot of money out of their own pockets in certain cases. The ideology of the Demokratia held that everyone was a part of the community and that they had obligations to fulfill. Those obligations got bigger the bigger a part you had of the Demokratia. So the more land you owned, the more wealth you possessed, the more of a duty you had to contribute to the upkeep of the Demokratia as a whole. And because of that, wealthy Athenians were required by law to perform what were known as liturgies. And liturgies are basically where an individual or group of relatively wealthy Athenians will use their private resources to fund major programs. For instance, Athens has a number of theatrical productions every year where they put on comedies and tragedies, and they need to pay and train choruses to sing at those, or dancers to perform, or playwrights to compose new works. Well, usually it is out of the pocket of a wealthy individual who will volunteer or be chosen to perform that duty. They are also required to, every other year, or maybe every third year, fund and command an individual trireme. So the warships of Athens, while they're publicly owned, they're rented out each year to a rich guy, and then he will be responsible for taking care of the ship and returning it as it is supposed to be. If the ship is damaged, or if gear goes missing, he will be fined and forced to replace what he lost. Now, unfortunately, I had to do a lot of research into how that actually worked, and it appears that a lot of people actually got away with pilfering a lot of stuff from the naval stores, but in theory, these guys could be held to account on that front. They also had to pay something called the war tax, which is basically where the Athenians had no money in their treasury, and they turned to a wealthy individual to give them money, or a group of wealthy individuals, usually the entire liturgical class of 300 to about 1,200 men, and they'd collect money from them and then use that to start a military expedition. Because by this point in history, the Athenians are really the first who pay all of their soldiers and sailors. And because of that, war is completely monetized, and the Athenians are in constant need of more money, and one of the major sources of that money are the private resources of their elite citizens, especially after the empire falls in the 5th century, something that we'll touch on briefly. So, in other words, the elite served more often and in more capacities than other Athenians, both at war and peace. And by the way, militarily, the Athenian elite also were more likely to get called up to serve. You could serve as a cavalryman, you could serve as a trierarch, you could get called up as a hoplite. There were lots of ways that Athens expected you to fight for it. So, if you're elite, you'll end up doing more work than if you're poor, which is the exact opposite of nearly every other society that I can think of, including, well, especially modern America. If I were forced to name just one element of the Demokratia, which is the beating heart or the core of what makes it what it is, I would say that it is the strict accountability measures that the Athenians implemented. The key to the power of the demos was the ability of the demos as a whole to hold the elite to account. Elite citizens could be taken to court for not performing their liturgies or for not performing them up to the level that corresponded with the ability to perform them. So, for instance, if someone was trying to do it on the cheap, they could actually be taken to court for that. Or if someone had become rich but was trying to conceal their wealth, then they could also be taken to court and forced to pay liturgies. There was actually a procedure that probably only happened maybe once or twice, but still did exist, called the antithesis, where someone could take another person to court and say, I've been on the hook for liturgies, but I know a man wealthier than I am, and I challenge him to take on my liturgies or otherwise trade estates, and then I will use his estate and the wealth from it to pay my liturgies. So, because the demos demanded accountability, the elite were willing to enforce it. And they actually are the ones who enforce it on each other. As I mentioned, all the prosecutors in the public interest are members of the elite. The officials who oversee this and encourage this kind of stuff to happen are often the generals, because they want to make sure that they have money for their campaigns. As for the generals, the trierarchs, and others, they could face some pretty stiff fines, exile, and even death sentences for malfeasance or failure. This was not all that common. It often gets exaggerated as a danger of being an Athenian elite, but these things could happen, and it does appear that the threat of these things happening helped a whole lot of people keep their noses clean. Average Athenians could be disciplined, but it seems that this happened rather rarely. For the most part, Athenians on campaign were not strictly disciplined. Generals, of course, were politicians, and they didn't want to alienate any of their potential voters or piss someone off so that they could try to prosecute them or vote to get them convicted later on. Because remember, the generals and their soldiers are all men from the same political community. Politically speaking, there's a great deal of equality between them. And so, generals rarely exercised their powers of discipline because they knew that it would be counterproductive in the long run. Now, when it comes to why I think accountability is the beating heart of the Athenian Demokratia, it is precisely because it is the fear that the elite have of the demos that keeps them in line. And without a certain level of fear and respect for the power of the demos, you can expect the elite to just run roughshod and to make a mockery of any pretense that a democracy exists, or that they adhere to the rule of law the same way that everyone else does. So, if anything, I find the most admirable thing about the Athenian Demokratia to be its strict accountability measures. And I'm not going to go into all the details of how they do accountability, but suffice it to say that this is something that is a regular feature of political life in Athens, and something that is very much baked in to the system, something that the Athenians themselves clearly did value because of how much effort they put into it and how many procedures even a good, clean-nosed, law-abiding official had to go through in order to prove that he was not, say, stealing money or doing anything else untoward. So now we turn to one of the more difficult issues both for an ancient demokratia and a modern democracy, the issue of equality. Typically speaking, we consider equality to be one of the major goals of a democratic society. And in a modern democracy, we tend to strive towards that, even if, say, government officials rarely pass policies which help that become a thing. We always hold up equality as one of the major goals that we have. In Athens, it's not altogether clear that equality, as we understand it, was much of a goal. So, for instance, the Athenians did have some degree of political equality. They could all serve by lot, for instance. They could all vote. In theory, they could all speak, but in practice, of course, most Athenians did not. And only the elite were able to seek and hold high office. So even on the political level, where the Athenians were most equal, they were not completely equal. We're talking about economically, there are some Athenians who are so fabulously wealthy that they owned 1,000 slaves, like Nicias, and even had a whole factory full of skilled slaves who produced shields. There were other Athenian citizens who barely had a plot of land to call their own and could only cobble together a bare minimum living. They were men who had no leisure, men who were living a hard-scrabble existence. Poor citizens also had very few opportunities to try to improve their station in life. They would have no employment opportunities in terms of going to work for another citizen, because citizens don't work for each other. The only opportunities that poor citizens would have to improve their lot in life would be to go on military campaigns and collect pay, but they're going to spend a lot of that money buying provisions along the way, or by working in the naval economy. Athens will develop a huge naval facility at Piraeus where skilled craftsmen can repair ships, or you could become someone who is a professional helmsman or even a professional flute player to keep all the rowers in line. So there were ways to make a living, but if you are just a common citizen, there aren't a lot of paths to great prosperity. And so just having the political equality or relative political equality that comes along with being a citizen would not lead to great economic opportunity necessarily. And again, a lot of the citizens could not read or could not read very well. So there was no public education or any other kind of great equalizer. So I would think that if the Athenians were deeply dedicated to equality the way that we think of it, they would at least institute public schools, but they never took that path. We also have to remember that citizens were not the only group in Athens, and in fact, they might not have even been a majority. Another major group that is a little bit harder to number are the Medics. These are resident aliens. They're free men who were born in other polis and reside in Athens. Many Medics are merchants or specialized craftsmen who moved to Athens in order to ply a trade. They could not legally own land, so they always had to rent their houses, and they also had to pay a head tax, which is basically a direct income tax, something that the Athenian citizens did not have to do, although you can make a case that the elite did pay a direct tax in the form of the war tax. But really, if we're talking about the elite citizens who do all these things for the Demokratia, these guys who have all the leisure to learn how to read, to serve as ambassadors, to serve as generals, to serve as triarchs, those guys only have the resources and leisure that they have because of slave labor. But before we talk about those guys, let's talk about Athenian women first. The old traditional view of Athenian women is that they were oppressed and cloistered. However, recent evidence suggests that it was a lot more complicated than all that. So as with the men, Athenian women were either citizens, medics, or slaves, and their status would greatly impact how they lived their lives, probably more so than their gender itself. Citizen women enjoyed most of the same privileges and protections of citizens that men had, except, of course, for the right to participate in politics directly. One thing that women did to a far greater extent than men, however, was to control the polis's religious life. So the relationship between Athens and the gods was mostly handled by women. And because most people in antiquity believed that the success or failure of any system, including the Demokratia, was ultimately dependent upon the will of the gods, you can actually make the argument that women were handling the more important task, at least by the standards of the day. Today, we tend to think of politics as being more important than religion, by and large, but in antiquity, that was not necessarily the case. And in fact, the most important single official in Athens, a person who did not have to be elected and did not have to really answer to anyone, was the priestess of Athena, Polias. And one of the priestesses who held that job for a long time lived to be in her 60s and was probably the most revered and feared of all of the Athenians in her lifetime. It got to the point where her authority on matters of religion was so great that even the generals and high-ranking officials would not dare contradict her. There was something of a male ideal about wives who were cloistered and effectively were prevented from leaving the home lest they should engage in adultery or get into some misadventure. But despite that ideal that appears in text written by men, we have a lot of evidence that suggests that women did not do that at all. So, we have lots of evidence around Attica of citizen wives, some of whom were clearly well off based on the dedications that they left, traveling by themselves or with neighboring women and going to visit places and making dedications. So we know that despite the male ideal of their wives staying home and being away from the prying eyes of other men, that's not exactly how they lived their lives. They kind of were able to do whatever they wanted, and the men do not seem to have been able to convince them otherwise. As far as the wives of poorer citizens, medic women, and slaves, they often worked alongside of males in their professions. So for instance, if you were the wife of a small-time artisan in the city of Athens proper, most likely you'd have to learn his trade, help him a great deal with it, including running a shop or going to get supplies from the agora or doing any number of other tasks. If you are a medic wife, you most likely would do the same. If you were a slave woman, well, you could do any number of tasks, but many of the female slaves of Athens were either agricultural, they did housework, they helped raise children, or they were prostitutes. And by the way, the high-class prostitutes, the heterae, were typically medics. Many of them were well-educated, actually probably more educated on the whole than citizen women. So they had a good deal of status, even if they did not have the protections of citizenship, and because they were unmarried, there were cases where they would be prosperous in their youth, but as they aged and became less sought after, they would often suffer from poverty and deprivation. So the experiences of women could vary a great deal depending on whether they were a citizen, a medic, or a slave, and then how much money their family had. And depending on the profession, especially of one's husband or one's owner, if you're a slave, that could really impact the kind of labor that you're called upon to perform. The traditional women's work of raising children and spinning the loom to make clothes, that applies to a lot of women, but we should not think that that is by any means the limit of what women did in antiquity, because they did a whole lot more than that. And also, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that women technically ran the household. Men spent most of their time outdoors, whether that was exploring the town or out in the fields or whatever it might be. And so not only did women control the household staff and raise the children, but they also managed the family's finances. So typically speaking, before the husband would go out every day, he'd have to go to his wife to get money. and she could basically decide how much she was going to give him. So, effectively, Athenian women were in charge at home. And this is something that seems to be both the ideal and the reality in Athens. There's a text by Xenophon where he has Socrates talk about how you train your wife in order to make her as effective of a household manager as possible. And the reason why you quote-unquote train your wife is because typically Athenian men married when they were 30 and their wives would typically be about 15. So they would still be learning a lot of basic life skills, and one of the things that a husband would need to teach his wife would be how to manage the finances. So, alright, not 15, 18, sorry. 15 is more the typical age of wives in Rome among the elite, but in Athens, 18 is a more typical marriage age for women. So, there you go. And now let's move on to the ultimate example of equality not quite being fulfilled in Athens. For all that the Demokratia did to make sure that there was some degree of equality between free citizens, the fact remains that all of it came on the backs of slave laborers. Attica had between 150 and 500,000 inhabitants in classical antiquity, and of that number, up to half of them were slaves. The conditions for slaves varied quite a bit in Athens. Some slaves worked in absolutely miserable conditions, such as the slaves who worked in the silver mines at Laurion. Some of them are pictured here. Some of the evidence that we have suggests that owners would lease out their slaves to work in the mines, and that a lot of slaves would be dead within 6 months. So far as we can tell, based on the evidence, Athenian mine slavery was by far the deadliest and worst form of slavery in all of antiquity, in terms of mortality rate and working conditions. Most slaves, however, like most free citizens, worked on farms, and many families would own 1 or 2 slaves. It was not uncommon for a citizen or even a medic to own a slave or 2. There were plenty of citizens, of course, who were too poor to own any slaves, but for the most part, it would be fairly typical for a family to have a slave. As far as the wealthy go, they typically owned a lot of slaves, and in fact, there were some slaves who had masters that had become very prosperous to the point that skilled slave craftsmen would often live in their own households with their own families and work independently, and then pay a sort of charge their master every year. So from the proceeds of their workshop, they would then take money to their master, but otherwise they'd live as if they were free people. And basically the thing to remember with slaves in Athens is that the amount of freedom you have and the level of lifestyle that you attain is entirely dependent on how indispensable your skill is. So if you are highly skilled, your master will tend to treat you with much more consideration. If you are someone who does mass labor, if you're just a regular farm slave, you are seen as being a little bit more expendable. What's really interesting is that when the Athenians would commission large-scale projects such as the building of the Acropolis, slaves who were working on these projects would receive the same wages as citizens. And this is partly to benefit slave masters who rent out their slaves, but also to avoid depressing wages. So now citizens don't have to compete with slaves for low wages. And that was something that, of course, the people would be very insistent upon. So if we look at the people who built the Parthenon, some of them were slaves, but they earned the same wages as the free men. Of course, those wages were then controlled by their masters. At the top of the sort of pyramid of slavery in Athens, there were banking slaves and the aforementioned demosioi. These men were exceptionally important to the operations of the city, and so they tended to be treated rather well, and they tended to dress better than poor citizens. Banking slaves often found themselves in a situation, at least in 1 or 2 very notable instances, where their master would be without an heir, and so because of the importance of his operation to the local economy, he would convince the demos to allow for the adoption and freeing of a slave and then having that person naturalized into a citizen. So one Athenian slave was freed and made a banker, Passian, and then his son Apollodorus also became a citizen and even became a triarch at one point. But for the most part, it was very rare to break into citizenship, especially for a slave. In Rome, it was actually very common. Manumission, that is freeing a slave, was a pretty common thing, and if you were on good terms with your master, you could expect to be freed at some point in your lifetime, and then your children, of course, would also be free. In Athens, there was no expectation of that sort. Slavery was largely for life. One interesting side note is that apparently slaves in Athens itself, the city, and around the Piraeus tended to look a lot like poor citizens. It was hard to tell them apart. They kind of dressed the same, and because slavery was not racial for the Greeks the way that it was, say, in the New World, it was hard to just look at someone and tell if they were a slave or not. And so this one author called the Old Oligarch complained that when he was having a bad day, he couldn't simply go up and beat up a slave in the streets to take out his frustrations, because it's possible that he might accidentally beat up a free man and then be taken to court charged with hubris and have that guy take his whole estate and then become wealthy. So, just keep in mind that when we look at all of the splendor of Athens, we talk about the freedom that many Athenians had, including the relative level of freedom for women, at least women with money. We have to remember that all of this freedom and leisure and all of these activities that the Athenians engage in, including the ability to have the leisure to develop history and philosophy and drama, all of that ultimately derives from leisure created by the labor of slaves. By way of conclusion, I just thought that I'd point out a few oddities of Athenian Demokratia, as if we don't have enough of them already. So, here are some things about Athens that you wouldn't expect based on a lot of what I've just told you about Demokratia. In the 5th century, Athens had an extensive naval empire. This is something that is very important to the history of Athens between the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars especially. This empire enabled them to extract tribute that they could then use to build up and maintain their navy. Indirectly, however, this enabled them to build up the Acropolis in grand fashion, because normally they would need to get money from other sources to spend on their navy, but because the empire was funding it, they had the freedom to invest heavily in monumental architecture. So if someone was being pedantic, they would point out to you that no, the empire didn't fund the Parthenon. But indirectly, it kind of did. Also, most of the senior priests and priestesses inherited their positions. So we talked about how it was by lot that most officials were chosen, and if not by lot, then by election. But when it comes to most of these senior priests and priestesses, most of them had to be born into a certain family, and that's how they got their position. Partly this is because many of these priesthoods predate the Demokratia, and also the idea is that these certain families were selected in deep antiquity by the gods. And as I mentioned too, Demokratia includes more than just the political, and the Athenians were very concerned to make sure that the affairs between themselves and the gods were conducted properly, and so they did not necessarily democratize elements of their religion the way that they did with so many other aspects of their society. One of the sort of, I guess you could call it, commonplaces of the modern world is that democracies never fight each other because they're unwilling to vote to go to war against one another. Well, there is actually an example of the Athenian Demokratia voting to fight the Syracusan Demokratia in 415. And yes, they were aware that Syracuse was a democracy. And so, one of the most bitter struggles in antiquity in terms of an existential struggle, and in terms of men deployed and men lost, was fought between two of the largest demokratias in Greek history. Probably the two biggest, actually. Athens being number one, Syracuse being a fairly close second, actually. Syracuse was actually extremely powerful. And another thing that we tend to take for granted, because we tend to think of citizenship as being sort of a package of rights or responsibilities that you can acquire through legal means. In Athens, if you're not born as a citizen, you almost certainly will die as a non-citizen. it was very, very difficult to break into citizenship. This applies to both Athens and every other polis, by the way. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was the banker Passian, who, because of his skills, was needed by the Athenians, so they made him a citizen. But another example of someone who was made a citizen because of his cultural contributions was Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who you might know as the father of history. So basically, unless everybody owes you money, or unless you invent a massive new genre of literature and study, you are not going to become a citizen of Athens. Even the men who helped to restore Athenian democracy in 403, who fought alongside Thrasybulus in the middle of winter, nearly freezing to death and being outnumbered heavily and fighting desperate battles with bare minimum arms. Even those men who were rewarded citizenship for their bravery, and there were only a few hundred of them, were later stripped of it. So, keep that in mind. The Athenians, the demos, they were very, very jealous of the right of citizenship. And they denied it to almost everyone who wanted it. So, anyway, those are my thoughts on the Athenian Demokratia and my attempt to show you that there are some very important differences between Athenian Demokratia and modern liberal democracy. So keep all of this in mind when you think of how Athens operated in antiquity, because what I've told you here applies. This is what's going on internally as they're fighting Persia and Sparta, and as they're vying for supremacy with Thebes and Macedon.